If one looks far enough back through history, virtually all peoples have been conquered peoples.
All people have been conquered and thrown into the pit, right? Nobody is special, and everyone had to fight equally as hard to climb out of the pit. And the one thing that they all have in common is that they had to climb out of the pit using their own free will, right? Nobody from outer space ever came to rescue anybody from the pit, right? They either had to figure it out or they stayed in the pit until later generations came and then figured it out for them. But one way or another, they had to figure it out and they had to grow during the process. And so one way they were able to grow is by borrowing cultural aspects from the more advanced groups. And the people who stayed in the pit, they failed to do so, which is what we'll see as we continue reading in the book, Race and Culture by Dr. Thomas Sowell, to see if we can get some understanding.
But a study of race and culture is concerned with those conquests which have made a cultural difference in the lives and history of the conquered and the conquerors. Before ancient Britain was invaded and conquered by the Roman legions, not a single Briton had ever done anything to leave his name in the pages of history.
Britain was invaded by the Romans in the 1st century CE, and Britain, it includes England, Scotland, and Wales. And we know that the English, who come from England, they eventually became prominent on the world scene, and they were the most advanced conquerors that ever stepped foot on the face of the planet Earth, right? But before the Romans conquered them, they weren't even worth mentioning in history, according to Dr. Thomas Sowell.
It was only after the coming of the Romans that buildings were constructed for the first time in Britain. Roads were also built by the Romans, towns developed, agricultural methods advanced, and sculpture and representational art in general spread. In Churchill's words, we owe London to Rome.
London is in England, which is in the UK, and so Winston Churchill was the Prime Minister of the UK, and he made that statement because he knew the history of the Romans invading England and his ancestors inheriting the knowledge from the Romans.
The contributions of Roman civilization to Britain were perhaps even more dramatically demonstrated by the consequences of the withdrawal of the Roman legions in the 5th century AD to return to the continent to defend the declining empire against its enemies there. By the beginning of the 6th century, British towns were crumbling, with buildings and statues in ruins. Roadways and waterways fell into disrepair, and in some places, wild vegetation, including forests, began to reclaim what had been human settlements. The dead began to be buried more crudely than before, often without coffins and in shallower graves. The governmental structure, which had unified most of the island under the Romans, now fragmented into tribal domains, too weak and disorganized to withstand marauders and invaders from continental Europe. Britain was not unique in its retrogressions after the decline and fall of the Roman Empire. On the continent as well, cities declined and in some places disappeared. Such goods as pottery, cloth, and metal products were more poorly made than in Roman times. An estimated 1,000 years passed before the material standard of living in Europe rose again to the level achieved under the Romans.
The first part of this 1,000 years of recovery is what used to be known as the Dark Ages. And dark meaning a time of ignorance and unenlightenment. And this is one of the reasons why we never refer to people as having dark skin, because it's attempting to link negative concepts with people's natural physical appearance, which was a pit that was set up by the colonizers that many people still need to climb out of to this day, right? And so after the Romans left from Britain, it took nearly 1,000 years for the people to resurrect from the dead. And when they did, they eventually came back stronger than ever.
Where cultural transfers occur as a result of prolonged subjugation of peoples less advanced than their conquerors, ambivalence has been one of the dominant notes of such conquest.
Ambivalence meaning mixed feelings. And so, of course, there were mixed feelings coming from people who were being controlled by others. And as a result, this is what happened.
More advanced conquerors have been hated, admired, imitated, and killed. Often, the ambivalence has been present within given individuals, as well as representing widely differing reactions among different groups among the conquered peoples. British rule in India produced much ambivalence on both sides, continuing long after independence. During the colonial era in Africa, many Africans who saw European civilization as a liberating advance over traditional indigenous culture nevertheless resented the racism that came with it.
Some of the Africans welcomed European civilization, but what they didn't fully realize was that the European who came over there were conquerors, right? And the idea of race was invented to keep certain groups with certain physical features down in the pit, right? And this was packaged with the European civilization that they brought with them.
To be called boy, to have to stand in queues and let any white person go ahead, signs for whites only, These things scared and angered Africans, especially the educated ones.
This was part of the mental conditioning that the colonizers implemented, right? This was to help jumpstart the Africans to start talking and thinking in racial terms of black and white, right? And seeing whites as being superior and then seeing themselves as being inferior. What we're talking about are high-level strategic games, and they definitely wanted these African people to start playing because they know once they start playing the game, it's a guaranteed win for the colonizers.
Similar and sometimes worse, things happened to many other conquered peoples, where they were racially distinct from the conquerors or physically indistinguishable. Cromwell's slaughters and mass confiscations of land in Ireland, and the oppressive and degrading laws which fastened second-class status on the Irish for more than a century thereafter, were all too typical of what other conquerors have done.
Cromwell was an English leader, and the English and the Irish, they hated each other, and that's regardless of them being phenotypically very similar. Because you have to understand that conquerors, they could care less about physical differences or physical similarities. They know that it's just a game, and only the uninformed people fall for it, right? And so the reality is they have no problem dominating people who look different from them or dominating people who look the same as them, right? And this is true with all colonizers from all parts of the world. Doesn't matter who it is.
The oppressions of various indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere by other indigenous peoples preceded the arrival of Columbus, and may help explain many American Indian tribes' decision to join with a new race from Europe in attacking their erstwhile oppressors.
These indigenous people were warring with each other way before Columbus arrived. And so the European colonizers, what they did is they used that to their advantage. And what they did was they used certain indigenous groups to help subdue the other indigenous groups. And so none of these groups cared that they were teaming up with other people who had different physical features to take down other groups who shared the same physical features. Like I said, it's only the uninformed people who buy into these type of ideas.
What is somewhat clearer is that those peoples conquered longer and more thoroughly subjected to the cultural hegemony of more advanced societies have tended themselves to excel in the economic and cultural realms in which the conquerors have had an advantage. It was precisely the southeastern part of Britain, England, that was conquered earliest and most thoroughly incorporated into the Roman Empire, which developed into the most advanced part of the British Isles.
The southeastern area is referring to England, and more specifically the London area. And one of the things that the English picked up from the Romans was how to dominate people, because the Romans, they were really good at doing this too. But the English, they advanced this thing to a level that the Romans could hardly even imagine, right? The English, when they got a hold of people, they put them in a daze for hundreds of years after they even finished conquering the people. Right? They still have people walking around today thinking of themselves as black people, right? And still worshiping the European gods, right? Their subjects still have not resurrected from the dead to this day, right? And so this is how good the English became at dominating people.
Centuries later, during the colonial era in India and Ceylon, members of the same racial or ethnic groups developed very different levels of skills, education, and economic initiative, according to whether they lived for long under the direct rule of the British or in regions that held out as independent regions.
The English make up part of the British, along with those living in Scotland and those living in Wales. And they had a much more advanced educational system, and the Indians who learned from them, they ended up in a better economic position than the ones who didn't.
Even after India achieved independence, the Andhras, who had lived under British rule, proved to be overwhelming competition for the Telangans, who had lived under Indian princes. Though racially and in most cultural aspects, they were the same people.
They were the same in many aspects, but much different in their acquired education and skills.
Similarly, in Sri Lanka, those Sinhalese who lived in regions conquered earlier by the British continued, generations later, to outperform their fellow Sinhalese from the Kandyan Highlands that remained independent longer.
And so what this shows is that even when conquered, there's still something to learn from the conquering people. And that's because there's an obvious reason why these people were able to conquer the people that they conquered. And that's due to them being more advanced in certain areas. And so the lesson is for people to take from those areas that the other people are more advanced in, especially if it benefits the group's aims and the group's goals. And then simply leave everything else behind that's not fitting and not of use, right? And so in other words, you chew on the meat and then you spit out the bones when you're climbing out of the pit and entering into the free world where life is much better and it makes more sense. And so this is the end of part 6 commentary on the book here, Race and Culture by Dr. Thomas Sowell, and I want to thank you for watching all the way until the end. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.